Have you ever known someone that considered you to be their best friend, even though to you they were barely more than an acquaintance? When I was a kid, that friend was Henry. I was always nice to him when I saw him in class, but we never really spent time with each other outside of school. That's why I was so surprised when he asked me to come spend the night at his house for his birthday celebration. To say that it was awkward would be putting it mildly. I was either the only guest invited or the only one that actually showed up. His father, who I learned was raising Henry as a single parent, was a large but quiet man. After he dropped the store-bought cake into the kitchen table, Henry and I were pretty much left to our own devices. Henry was a big horror fan. He showed me his room that was covered in posters like Wolfman and Dracula. He had stacks of worn-out EC comics in every corner of the room. Instead of playing with G.I. Joes, he had me play with a Barbie doll, and while he was chasing her with an alien creature action figure, it wasn't my favorite birthday party. When the hour had gotten late, Henry's dad told us to shut off the light and go to bed. I couldn't have been happier. I was ready for this night to be over. But naturally, Henry had other ideas. Within seconds of his father's footsteps fading away, Henry had a flashlight in hand and was ready to start telling me scary stories. Henry told me about the time his dad was attacked in the woods by a deformed humanoid creature. The monster had pounced on him and started to claw at his face, but he wasn't able to overpower it, and he also crushed his windpipe. But the creature kept coming back. The monster could show up at any moment and attack Henry's dad, but every time the outcome was the same. Henry's dad was able to overpower and kill the monster, only for it to rise up again and attack him later. Eventually, the monster found him back at their house. It waited as the family slept and attacked that night. The monster killed Henry's mother before his dad was able to strike it down. Henry's dad set him down and tried to explain about the monster, how there was no way to stop it from coming back, and that it wouldn't stop until it had taken everything from him, so he had no choice but to lock it up in the basement. He warned Henry never to go into the basement because he might accidentally let the monster out. The story was pretty corny. Henry seemed annoyed when I laughed and told him how it wasn't true, but he told me it was all true. He tried to goad me into going in the basement if I thought I was lying. Luckily, Henry's dad banged on the door at that moment and told us to be quiet and go to sleep. I gladly rolled over and shut my eyes. A few hours later, I woke to a full bladder and awkwardly felt my way along the dark hallway to try and find the bathroom. After I flushed and washed my hands, I made my way back to Henry's bedroom. I stopped dead in my tracks when I heard the faint sound of footsteps on the stairs behind the door to the basement. Henry's story may have been stupid, but when you are all alone in the dark in an unfamiliar house, it starts to come true. A silly story starts to sound a lot more plausible. So I stood there perfectly still and listened as the footsteps got closer and closer to the top of the stairs. Something behind the door latched onto the doorknob and started to wiggle it back and forth, slow at first, but it quickly became more frantic. The door began to heave in and out as the monster behind the door tried to rip it open. The beast that previously tried to stay very quiet no longer seemed to care. I could hear its inhuman zombie-like moans as it put every ounce of strength into opening that locked door. I ran as fast as I could into Henry's dad's room. I was talking a mile a minute, and I tried to explain to him that the monster was trying to get out of the basement. He practically had to shake some sense into me to get me to talk in a comprehensible manner. When he finally realized that I was trying to warn him that the monster was about to escape the basement, his eyes went wide. He told me to stay in the room and to lock the door. I could see it in his face. The fear in that grown man's eyes left no doubt that Henry's story was all too real. I waited, hiding under the blankets in the room for what seemed like hours before he returned, along with his son. Henry's dad told me to come out into the kitchen, where we could have some more cake and he would explain everything. As it turns out, it was all a dumb prank. Henry had snuck out of his room when he heard me leave to go to the bathroom. It was him behind the basement door making scary noises and pretending like he was coming to rip me limb from limb. His dad made him apologize and promise never to scare me like that again. I felt like an idiot. Henry's story was so stupid, and yet I had completely fallen for his prank. It should come as a surprise that Henry and I kind of drifted apart after that. I really never considered him much of a friend to start with, so it wasn't all that difficult to start pushing him away after that disaster of a birthday sleepover. The OP later explains that she hadn't seen Henry in over a decade, but that he had called her when he gotten injured, and that he said that no one else would help him, so she decided to go and help him and all that. So it says then, eventually Henry broke the silence. To my surprise, he brought up that night, his birthday celebration, the last time I had been here. He asked me if I remembered that, like I could have ever forgotten, so I just laughed and lied about what a great time I had. Then he asked if I remembered the monster in the basement. All these years, and it seemed that Henry hadn't changed at all. For a split second, it even crossed my mind that all of this was just an elaborate plan to prank me again, that he had his friends ready to burst out from the basement and spray me with silly string, just so Henry could laugh at me again. But Henry was dead serious. He couldn't even lift his head to look at me in the eye as he continued to talk. He told me that the monster was real, and it was hungry. Henry had been in the hospital for a while, but it had been far too long since the monster had fed. The bowls of canned food that Henry had me prepare weren't for us. He wanted me to take them downstairs. I was dumbfounded. Did he really think I was this stupid? I didn't even bother to answer him. I just stood up, grabbed my keys, and prepared to leave. If this was how Henry was going to reward my kindness, I wouldn't feel bad about abandoning him. But Henry grabbed my wrist as I tried to walk away. He looked at me with tears forming in his eyes and his lips quivering as he begged me to take the food down to the basement. Please, take the food down. I'll explain everything when you come back. It'll make more sense if I see you first. Something in my mind told me that I needed to do this. I wasn't afraid to go back down to the basement door that had terrified me so many years ago, but I needed closure. I needed to see if Henry was full of it, and there was nothing but a normal old basement behind that door. I wheeled Henry over the basement, and he unlocked it. He waited by the top of the staircase as I opened the door and started to descend. The smell was overwhelming. Not just mildew or mold like you would expect in an old dank basement. It was a living smell, sweat, feces, human filth. Something was down there. I slowly made my way down the stairs. The sights and sounds of that childhood night flooded my brain as I headed back down to the stairs, mimicking the sound of the monster from years ago. This time I traced the monster's steps in reverse as I practically tiptoed my way down the stairs, with my shirt raised around my nostrils to keep the smell at bay. When I reached the bottom, I saw it, them, huddled in a dark corner at the far end of the basement. I had dropped the bowls of food, and they shattered on the concrete floor, alerting the others to my presence. They barely had the strength to lift their heads and look at me. Their skin was stretched tight from starvation, revealing the curve of every bone in their body. Heads were nearly bald from malnutrition, and they were covered in scars. They looked every bit the monster that Henry had described to me that night so many years ago, but now I knew better. They were human, beaten, abused, and tormented, but just as human as I was. Slowly they crawled towards me. I was still frozen. It was like when I was a child. They crawled their way across the floor, but their outstretched hands weren't coming for me. They wanted the food that was spilled around my feet. The chains were latched tightly to their ankles, and it stopped them from sort of reaching. I looked in horror at the scars of years of struggling against those chains. The skin all the way up their legs was red with infection, but they didn't stop trying. They stretched and pawed at the ground, trying to get a little bit closer to the food that was just beyond their grasp. I'm ashamed to admit that I backed up and started to run up the stairs. I stopped when they started moaning, identical to the sound I heard behind the door when I was a child. I turned and I saw their pleading faces, their mouths empty of tongue and teeth. When I turned back around, Henry was staring down at me from the top of the staircase. He had one of his good hands tightly latched around the door, ready to slam it shut. "Finish feeding them," he said coldly. I stood there, still frozen, but my mind was racing. I was terrified of what I saw down there, and I was terrified of Henry. He was the true monster here. None of these things he kept up in the basement, but right now, Henry was no threat to anyone. Henry must have saw it in my face. He was so used to controlling the pair of captives and didn't like seeing the look of defiance on my face. He quickly slammed the door shut, and I could hear him struggling with the keys as I sprinted up the stairs, 2 steps at a time. I launched my shoulder into the door, knocking Henry over and spilling him out onto the floor before he could lock me down there in his basement. The moans of the captives in the basement still echoed behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran straight for the front door and immediately called the police. Henry was surprisingly forthcoming when they interrogated him. He hadn't planned on locking me down there with them. He wanted me to join him, to be a partner like him, just to see what he had done like his father, just below the basement, and his captives just so many years ago. It turns out that the monster in the basement was his father's own rage. His father had held kidnapped girls in the basement for decades, abusing them, allowing him to keep his monstrous side safe and hidden from the world. When Henry was old enough, he recognized the monster inside him and allowed Henry to join him in the basement. Henry hadn't planned on adding me to his list of captives. He wanted me to join him as his new partner while he recovered from his injuries. I'm tormented by the memories of that night, the sleepover at Henry's house, even though I eventually became their savior. I'll never be able to forget that I am directly responsible for preventing their escape all those years ago. I doomed them to decades more time trapped and as captives in that basement because when I heard them, I ran and alerted their captor. I was allowed the monster to continue to thrive in that basement. There were some typos in that, but oh well.